Beginning of time, war has been part of human history. From the Punic Wars to the Crusades, the strategies and formations have been the same. The infantry would line up in the front lines, followed by the archers and the small artillery, with the large artillery taking up the rear. This style of warfare would remain the same until the creation of a weapon that would revolutionize war altogether. Hello, I'm Christian Johnson, and in this documentary, we will look at the tactics and innovations that have revolutionized war for the United States and the world. This is the evolution of war.
The Civil War, the war of innovation and advancement, is the war that puts the ball in motion for the evolution of warfare, and was the war where the United States fought itself over an ideology and the protection of a union that had stood for a little under a century. The two sides that fought during the Civil War were the Union and the Confederate States. This war was classified as a gentleman's war. A gentleman's war is where the men would line up in columns and take turns shooting at each other. On April 12, 1861, an attack on Fort Sumter triggered a war that would become the bloodiest war in the United States history. The Phalanx, a group of heavily armed infantry formed in ranks and files, close and deep. With shields joined and long spears overlapping, this formation of troops was a default style from the Punic Wars to the Crusades. Throughout the Civil War, both the Union and the Confederation used a similar formation style. The style that was used was a firing line. The soldiers would line up 3 or 4 deep, where the front 2 lines would fire, while the other lines would reload guns and fill in for a dead soldier if need be. The reason why the firing line was used in this war was because it was the same fighting style used during the Revolutionary War, and they weren't exposed to anything different prior. Due to there was not a lot of change in the formation aspect of the war, the inventions made to enhance warfare compensated for the lack of change. Before the Civil War, rifles like the Springfield were classified as a musket. Muskets needed to be reloaded by loading the charge and the bullet through the barrel of the gun and packing the two together in the chamber. This was a very slow process. The Civil War, however, introduced the repeating rifle into the picture. Some of the repeating rifles that were used in the Civil War were the Colt revolving rifle and the Spencer carbine. The Colt revolving rifle had an increased in ammunition and capacity from 1 to 5 rounds. The Spencer carbine is an extremely special case because it introduced the first magazine into a rifle, which could hold up to 7 rounds. Pistols of the time were redesigned as well. The Colt Dragoon was the result of this update. The Colt Dragoon is a 6-shot black powder revolver. The increase in ammunition capacity in the gun increased the amount of time the soldier would be on the battlefield and also reduced the reload time for the gun. Even though the guns were redesigned, they were not the most important innovation of the Civil War. The mini-ball, designed by a Frenchman, got rid of the standard ball rounds that were used in the Revolutionary War. The mini-ball is designed to pierce through the air rather than rip through it, like the musket ball did. This increased the accuracy and range for the rifles and the pistols in the Civil War. The Gatling gun was the world's first machine gun. With 7 barrels and a semi-automatic operating system, the Gatling gun became a pivotal instrument for war. How the Gatling gun worked was by having one man turn a hand crank which would cock the hammer and rotate the barrel into place. Once the barrel was in place, a round would fall into the chamber, release the hammer, thus firing the round. A second person would load the rounds into a hopper or a feeder attached to the gun. The Gatling gun was introduced during the siege of Petersburg. and then was adopted by the U.S. Army in 1866. Along with formations and technological innovations, strategies are key to winning wars. At the beginning of the Civil War, both sides did not have a strategy because they thought it would only last 1 or 2 battles. When the 2 battles came and went, however, the strategies began to form. The Union's plan was called the Anaconda Plan. The plan basically was to strangle the Confederacy into submission. The Union placed a blockade all around the South to stop trade from entering and exiting. This was to stop the economic growth and military transport and weaken the South so they would be forced to return to the Union. The Confederacy's plan was the offensive-defensive plan. This is where the Confederacy would defend their homeland with communication and have concentrated, dispersed forces engage invading forces. If the opportunity presented itself, then the Confederacy were to go on the offensive and push the enemy back. The results of this 4-year-long war were massive. 620,000 men were killed, and 476,000 men were wounded. Most of the deaths were a result of non-combat related diseases the troops got while fighting. The ratio for field to disease death was for every 3 soldiers killed in the field, 5 would die by disease.
World War I began in 1914 and was fought unlike any other. It became the first industrial war. Countries were taking over other countries in order to use their natural resources, so imperialism became a huge issue at the start of the Great War. Nations were able to mass-produce supplies, therefore they had a constant supply of war products. This resulted in the fact that there was no longer a natural end to a war. We now needed a bigger reason. The 2 opposing sides of World War I were the Central Powers, which consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey, against the Allied Powers, which mainly consisted of Great Britain, France, the United States, and Greece. These nations teamed up to go to war with one another, making it the bloodiest war to date. Trench warfare became one of the most iconic methods of combat during the Great War. Both sides dug trenches that extended for hundreds of miles. Together, the Allies and the Central Powers dug nearly 62,500 miles of trenches by the end of 1914. The Allies used 4 types of trenches. First was the front-line trench, where most of the firing took place. Several hundred miles behind the front lines was where the support trench was stationed. The support trench was filled with men and supplies that could immediately be called upon when needed. Several hundred yards behind that was the reserve trench, which was filled with even more soldiers and supplies in the event that the first 2 trenches are overrun. Connecting all of these trenches were communication trenches, which were in charge of passing along messages and supplies. No Man's Land was the nickname of the region in between both sides. Machine guns, long-range rifles, and barbed wire made it nearly impossible to cross this land into enemy territory, causing a stalemate. The response to this long-lasting stalemate was chemical warfare. First developed by the French but made lethal by the Germans, the soldiers fought from trenches by releasing poisonous gas into the air, which relied on the direction of the wind to carry it into enemy camps. This type of weapon made it necessary for the development of gas masks and other protective gear to combat the toxins. Most poisonous gases, such as chlorine, tear gas, phosgene, and diphosgene, caused temporary blindness, serious irritation to the throat and nose, suffocation, and even death. The most lethal gas used during World War I was mustard gas, which was invented by the Germans and later made illegal to use during wartime. But the true answer to a stalemate were tanks. Tanks were one of the most iconic developments that came out of World War I. They were designed to cross no man's land. Tanks were large armored vehicles designed to drive through barbed wire, trenches, and withstand flying bullets. Tanks were equipped with machine guns and several men. However, early versions of the tanks had a slight design flaw that was not exactly conducive to crossing wide trenches. They also only moved a couple of kilometers per hour and had carbon monoxide fumes that could poison its crew. By 1917, tank engineers started to improve the technology, and tanks became pivotal in battle. Other standard weapons for infantrymen were rifles and pistols. However, with the new technology of machine guns, their rapid rate of fire made them one of the most deadly weapons on the front line. The Germans had far more machine guns and better quality as well. Machine guns were capable of firing up to 500 rounds per minute. However, they quickly overheated and required water or air-based cooling systems to prevent them from jamming or exploding, which posed a threat to the 5 or 6 men it took to operate the gun. Battle strategies on land were being improved by the technology of weapons of mass destruction. Although mankind was progressing on land, World War I was the first time that aircraft was used on a large scale. Germany used Zeppelins for dropping bombs on enemy territory. Airplanes were still fairly new to the military and were too unstable to use for actual combat, so their main use was for spying. Towards the end of World War I, fighter planes became very important. Pilots went from throwing grenades at each other as they fly by, or rather float by, to shooting machine guns in order to bring down enemy planes. Air combat was inevitable and a strategic move that changed warfare forever. Thus was the start of the Air Force, which became more efficient and reliable during the Second World War. Essentially, the battle strategies have remained the same for centuries, which was to gain more land and territories. However, what made World War I different from all the previous wars was the changing in the nature of how we fight. There were no columns of soldiers lining up to fight in a gentleman-like manner. Instead, soldiers would actively go after civilians, destroy cities and villages, and cut off entire nations' supplies so they would become weak and surrender. The results of the First World War were catastrophic. Cities had been destroyed by bombs, and nations were left with nothing but anger towards Germany. Overall casualties of the First World War was roughly 37 million people. The Treaty of Versailles was signed June 28, 1919, which officially ended the war, and the League of Nations was formed in order to oversee all future conflicts. The War Guilt Clause was passed, which forced Germany to accept full responsibility for World War I. They are given the responsibility of paying for the war, which was a total of $33 billion. They were also forced to reduce their military forces and split apart their territories, thus laying the groundwork for World War II.
At last, my love has come along. My lonely days are over, and life is like a song. Oh yeah, yeah, at last the skies above are blue. My heart was wrapped up in clover. For you are mine at last.
Interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific.
America declared war on Japan on December 8, 1941, after the Japanese attacked U.S. naval base Pearl Harbor. On this day, December 7, 1942, 2,402 Americans, military and civilians, were killed and another 1,282 were wounded. The biggest area of casualty for the United States was the USS Arizona, where 1,102 of the 1,177 sailors who were killed were stationed. By the end of 1942, all men ages 18 to 64 were required to join the draft, but they mostly concentrated on men under the age of 38. Approximately 36 million men registered. Most men volunteered rather than wait to be drafted so that they could pick their own branch of service. Men were not the only ones helping with the war effort. On the home front, the unemployment levels were at an all-time low. The need for workers with men going off to war opened up a lot of job opportunities for women and African Americans. Women in the workforce increased by 60% as 5 million women joined the workforce. Many of the new workers were older or married and needed to support their families as their husbands were out fighting the war. The women were working factory and industrial jobs that involved welding, riveting, and drill operators. This is where Rosie the Riveter was born. Women were also allowed to join the military as nurses and pilots. Working was not the only thing people on the home front were doing to help the war effort. Ration books were distributed with a set amount of food and supplies. You could only get as much as your ticket allowed. Everyday items were also rationed, items like sugar, coffee, meat, shoes, gasoline, tires, and nylons. With tires and gasoline being rationed, people were driving less and carpooling more. People were also encouraged to not talk about the war because they were told there were spies everywhere. The Battle of Midway, fought in June 1942, was considered one of the most decisive battles of World War II. This battle was fought at Midway Island and the United States effectively destroyed the Japanese Navy. Japan never fully recovered from this battle. The invasion of Normandy, led by General Eisenhower, took place on June 6, 1944, on 5 beaches with the codenames Utah Beach, Omaha Beach, Gold Beach, Juno Beach, and Sword Beach. To throw the Germans off, the Allies used fake ships and acted like they were going to attack Italy and southern France. The Germans failed to successfully defend Normandy from the Allied liberation forces and doomed Hitler's dreams of a Nazi-controlled fortress Europe. This marked the beginning of the end for Germany. The invasion of Normandy was the largest and most powerful armada to ever sail. The last major offensive for the Nazis against the Allies was the Battle of the Bulge. This battle was fought over the winter months of 1944 and 1945. This was Hitler's last attempt to split the Allies in two, drive them towards Germany, and make it so the Allies were unable to supply themselves. This was a surprise attack on the Allies, but the German army was so run down from fighting that the battle only lasted for 2 days, leaving the American army with 81,000 casualties and the Germans with 100,000 casualties. This was the largest battle fought by the Americans. The Allies wanted Germany to surrender unconditionally, but Hitler felt that if the Germans couldn't win the war, then they didn't deserve to live. So on April 30th, Hitler killed himself, his family, and his dog. On May 8th, 1945, Germany surrendered to the Allies. But this did not mark the end of the war for the United States. FDR died in April of 1945, leaving his successor, Truman, with no knowledge of what was happening thus far. On the way to Potsdam, Truman studied up on what had been happening and wouldn't give in to Stalin's demands at the conference. At the Potsdam Conference, Truman received news that the Manhattan Project had been successful, but Stalin already knew because he had spies intercept the telegraph. The race to build the atomic bomb started in 1938 when word spread that a German scientist had split the uranium atom. On July 16, 1945, the world's first nuclear test, codenamed Trinity, was conducted in New Mexico. Truman decided the bomb would be dropped on Japan. The first bomb, known as Little Boy, was dropped on Hiroshima from the B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay. It resulted in 66 instantaneous deaths. The total destruction ranged about 1 mile in diameter, and serious fires extended 3 miles in diameter. 3 days later, a larger atomic bomb called Fat Man was dropped on the town of Nagasaki. In a split second, 39,000 people were killed. April 15, 1945 became known as Victory over Japan Day. This was the official end of the war with Japan. The United States had a few good military leaders throughout the war. General Patton was commanding the only all-American force known as the Western Task Force for Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. He also commanded the 7th Army in July of 1943 during the invasion of Sicily, and with the help of British 8th Army, he helped return Sicily to its citizens. Patton was given command of the 3rd Army in France in 1944, where they exploited German weaknesses across Europe and then liberated the Buchenwald concentration camp. By the end of World War II, the 3rd Army had liberated or conquered 81,522 miles of territory. Another significant leader during World War I was General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was the commander of the invasion of Normandy. His invasion included approximately 7,000 ships and landing crafts with 195,000 men from 8 of the Allied countries. There were also about 133,000 troops from England, Canada, and the United States. By June 30th, more than 850,000 men, 148,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of supplies were dropped on the shores of Normandy. With the help of the Allies on the Western Front and the Russians on the Eastern Front, Eisenhower led the troops to the defeat of the German forces, and on May 7, 1945, the unconditional surrender of the German general Alfred Jodl at Reims, France. In total, the United States suffered a total of 418,500 military and civilian deaths. Worldwide, 15 million people died in battle, and another 25 million people were wounded. The total number of civilian deaths was approximately 45 million, but these numbers are not exact, especially because of all the instantaneous vaporizations in Japan from the dropping of the atomic bombs.
Though war was never officially declared, the military involvements of the U.S. against the Viet Cong would be the longest response to date, taking the lives of 58,000 Americans and costing the U.S. billions of dollars. The problems go back to the Indochina War, when France loses its colony in Vietnam. Since the 19th century, France has been the residing presence amongst the Vietnamese people, most of its influences dominating the southern regions near Saigon. During the Second World War, the French were expelled from Vietnam by Japan, which occupied Vietnam for most of the war. Ho Chi Minh, a proclaimed communist and fan of Western culture, along with his allies, assisted U.S. Army intelligence in the war against the Japanese. When the U.S. claims victory over Japan, Vietnam is declared independent. Ho heads and drafts a new Vietnamese constitution that is much like the U.S., and for a time, the two are allies. However promising the image, the mounting pressure from France, as well as Washington to re-establish French order, and the growing fear of Soviet and communist influence in Asia, pushed the U.S. to support a retaliation that results in a crushing defeat in the signing of the Geneva Accords of 1954. This treaty essentially divides Vietnam between Ho Chi Minh's forces in the north and establishes a pro-American government led by Ngo Dinh Diem in the south. With time, tension rises in Vietnam and the Xian regimen is unstable. Buddhist monks set themselves on fire in a public display of opposition. Ho Chi Minh has widespread support everywhere in Vietnam, the prevailing symbol of unification between northern and southern Vietnam, and has long since retracted his affection toward the U.S. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident, when direct conflict arose between northern Vietnamese and U.S. military, Congress grants new President Lyndon Johnson the power to use military force, to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack, and to prevent further aggression from the Vietnamese. It is this congressional ruling that launches the U.S. into the undeclared war against the northern Vietnam communists. Due to an overwhelming confidence and technological superiority, the U.S. takes its offensive on the Viet Cong to the skies. U.S. military initiates heavy bombing throughout northern Vietnam. More bombs were dropped on Vietnam in 1 year than in all of World War II, causing severe damage to the enemy. However, this is not enough to subdue the Viet Cong. The enemy rallies the Vietnamese further for independence. It is this that essentially made things very difficult for the U.S. armies. Opposition growing amongst the natives meant there was no defined enemy for one to target. Unlike prior wars involving the U.S. that were fought in familiar Europe, the guerrilla war was fought on difficult terrain, again with no defined front lines. North Vietnamese avoided fighting conventional battles and focused on engaging U.S. troops in small unit actions in the sweltering jungles of South Vietnam. The whole war adopted a hit-and-run mentality that included, but was not limited to, ambushes, sabotage, and raids that ultimately devastated American troops and brought the war no closer to resolution. To add to the dodgy tactics, the Viet Cong headquarters were secured deep in the jungle terrain. To make maneuvering quiet and secure, Ho Chi Minh ordered nearly 200 tunnels to be built for better maneuvering of units or supplies. American troops learned very quickly how hostile the Vietnamese backyard was. Troops were in constant fear of homemade mines hidden throughout the jungles, as well as booby traps, including hidden bamboo maces or crossbows that could be triggered when soldiers stepped on a tripwire. One particularly common menace was the punji stake trap, a bed of sharpened bamboo stakes that was concealed in a pit for enemy soldiers to stumble across. Operating in unpredictable and hostile regions soon made it difficult for Americans to tell North and South Vietnamese people apart. As soldiers took less precaution in this, word traveled of war crimes and failures of the war. Soon the U.S. had accumulated much opposition from people on the home front. Protests were held throughout the nation, on college campuses, and in public parks. The soldiers that the citizens once rallied behind were now looked down upon. As the true nature of the war leaped, morale in Vietnam was at an all-time low. It became prevalent that the war would no longer be supported by the American people. With the onslaught of new protesters and the leak of the Pentagon pages, proof of the deliberate misdirection and communication from the U.S. government, on January 27, 1973, a treaty was signed and peace was declared, a rather abrupt end to an embarrassing war. To add insult to injury, the withdrawal of American troops resulted in the fall of Saigon and the reunion of northern and southern Vietnam. In conclusion of the Vietnam War, the southern Vietnamese government collapsed, and for the first time, the Americans felt the sting of failure and humility on an international level.
From the muskets of the Civil War to the assault rifles in the Vietnam War, from the biplanes of World War I to the fighter jets of today, the evolution of warfare has changed how we look and approach war. War has changed from a gentleman's war to a war where everything is fair. At the speed it is going, there is no sign of stopping the change. As long as human evolution has war as its shadow, warfare will continue to evolve. This is the evolution of war.